Hi, I'm Schaap Pierce, and thank you for joining me today for devotions from Central Reformed Church. It's been 3 weeks. 3 weeks have passed since schools closed. 3 weeks since we as a community started hearing that the virus had made it to Michigan. 3 weeks since worship in our sanctuary was canceled, since meetings moved to Zoom or phone calls, since we started wondering how safe it was to go to the grocery store. In those weeks, I have tried to power on, to move forward, to gather people virtually, to inspire hope, to homeschool, to exercise with kids crawling all over me. But this week, I got tired of powering on, and I finally acknowledged the grief that I was feeling. The news that schools were closing for the rest of the year was heartbreaking for my first grader, and it was heartbreaking for me too. She has been grieving daily, not being able to see her friends or her teacher. The news of a friend and colleague who had tested positive for the virus and was now in the ICU on a ventilator brought me to my knees in prayer, but also in grief. I wonder if the gospel story this Sunday, which noted that Jesus wept over the passing of Lazarus, didn't also give me permission to cry. One of the things that I think is different about this crisis is that we're experiencing grief collectively, together. Together, we are grieving a loss of routine, a loss of normalcy, a loss of connection. Some of us are grieving the loss of jobs or of full employment. Some are grieving the loss of a graduation or prom, of planned travel. We wonder about the economic toll that this will take on our families, on small businesses, and on our nation. Well, I was reading an interview with grief expert David Kessler, and he said that there are many types of grief we are experiencing in this crisis. But one of the most prominent types is what he calls anticipatory grief. And he explains it as the feeling that we get about what the future holds when it's uncertain. And usually this centers around death. So we anticipate the death of a parent someday, or maybe a dire diagnosis. Anticipatory grief, he says, is also more broadly imagined futures. There is a storm coming. There's something bad out there. With no end in sight to this health crisis we're currently in, this type of grief really resonates with me. And this is perhaps complicated by the fact that the very thing that we anticipate, the coming or arrival of this virus in our own community and people getting sick, is caused by something that we can't see. At least in zombie or alien films, the enemy is tangible, but this enemy is microscopic. Jesus wept. The women wept at the cross. Mary wept at the tomb. When David Kessler was asked, how should people deal with grief in this current crisis? He made 4 recommendations. First, he says that we should seek out a balance in our thinking. So in other words, don't catastrophize. Second, he says we need to come into the present, breathe, acknowledge that you're okay, and maybe even give thanks for what you have. Third, he recommends letting go of what we can't control. I know I need to do that. And fourth, he says we should stock up on compassion. And I actually think we're pretty good about this, but there's always room for growth, right? So be patient, be kind. Remember that each person out there is grieving in his or her own way. One thing that I think is important to remember in this moment, and I'm giving myself permission to, even as I say this, is that it is possible to be greatly grieved by the situation and still to have great faith. Just because Jesus wept didn't mean he thought that there was no hope. Just because Mary wept didn't mean she couldn't believe that Jesus had raised from the dead. Even in their grief, Mary and Jesus did amazing things. Jesus resurrected Lazarus, and Mary was the first witness to and first one to tell about Jesus' resurrection. You can be greatly grieved by this situation and still have great faith. So I wonder, what are you grieving? And also, how might your faith or the faith of others be strengthened by the grief that you are experiencing? I pray that the Spirit who accompanied Jesus on the cross and made space for silence and grief on Holy Saturday will accompany you today and going forward as we anticipate both darker and brighter days ahead.